The churchyard at Briarwick was not yet cold when the first woman spat. She stood near the lich gate, a farmer's wife in a good black bonnet, and she did not trouble herself to be discreet about it. She turned her head to the side, pursed her lips, and the sound was small and deliberate, aimed at no specific stone, but at the slight figure in gray wool who had walked the entire length of the gravel path from the church door without speaking to anyone. The woman in gray did not flinch. She had heard it. The set of her shoulders confirmed that she had heard it. She walked to her place beside the open grave, folded her gloved hands at her waist, and looked down at the coffin of Edward, the late Earl of Ashvale, with an expression that the assembled mourners of 3 counties could not quite read. Her name, to those who had asked at all, was Mrs. Wren. A widow, they said. His widow, possibly, though no one could confirm the ceremony or the date. She had appeared at Ashvale 3 years ago, quietly, without announcement, and the old Earl had declined to explain her presence to anyone, including his heir. She wore no jewels. Her gown was gray rather than the correct mourning black. And Lady Dorothea Pembridge, standing at the front of the assembled mourners with her garnet brooch and her unimpeachable posture, had noted the gray gown before the church door had fully opened, and had leaned to the woman at her side to say, in a voice pitched to Carrie, that some people's grief could not stretch as far as a proper dressmaker. That remark was the second cut of the morning. The first had been delivered at the church door itself, when Dorothea had looked through Eliza as though she were a pane of glass in a cold passage, and had turned to receive the hand of Cecily Hargrove with a warmth so calibrated it was practically an announcement. Eliza had noted all of it. She noted things the way a woman learns to note them when her survival depends on accurate observation rather than loud protest. She noted the garnet brooch, which she recognized as a piece that had been packed away in the Ashvale jewel cabinet before she had arrived, and which Dorothea had apparently recovered during the 3 days since the Earl's death. She noted the solicitor, a compact and serious man in a dark coat, who had positioned himself at the edge of the burial ground near the old yew tree with a document satchel under his arm and the stillness of a man waiting to perform a specific and non-negotiable duty. She had not expected him to come to the graveside. She had expected him to wait until after, in the Earl's study, with the family arranged in chairs. She had, it appeared, underestimated Edward's sense of occasion. The service proceeded in the way that country funerals proceed in November, with the vicar's breath visible in the cold air, and the yew tree dropping its small red berries onto the churchyard stones at irregular intervals, and the assembled county of Wiltshire standing in their blacks and their borrowed solemnity, watching the woman in gray with the sideways attention of people who believed they were being discreet. James Ashvale stood at the head of the grave. He had arrived from London the previous afternoon, and Eliza had not yet spoken to him, nor he to her. She had seen him at a distance in the entrance hall of the great house, tall and controlled in his traveling coat, his face arranged into the particular blankness that she had come to recognize, in the 3 days since his arrival, as the expression he wore when he was deciding what he thought. He had looked at her across the hall. She had met his gaze for 3 full seconds before looking away first. She looked away first because looking away first was what women in her position did, and she had been doing it for 3 years, and it had not yet cost her anything she could not afford. James did not look away. She registered that fact the way she registered the solicitor's position near the yew tree, without attaching a conclusion to it, filing it against some future use she could not yet name. The vicar closed his book. The coffin was lowered. Dorothea touched her eyes with a folded handkerchief, and Cecily stood at her elbow with her beautiful face arranged in the correct attitude of modest sympathy, her dark curls barely contained beneath a bonnet that had not been purchased at a Briarwick milliner's shop. Eliza watched the coffin reach the bottom of the grave. She thought of Edward, who had been 73, and had smelled of pipe tobacco and lavender water, and had told her, at the end of their 3rd year together, that he had made his arrangements, and that she was not to worry. She had told him she was not worried. She had been lying, and he had known she was lying, and he had patted her hand and said that the solicitor had everything in hand. Mr. Aldous Fenn cleared his throat. The sound was not loud, but it had an authority to it. The particular authority of a man who has waited a long time to speak and intends to be heard. Several heads turned. Fenn walked from the yew tree to the edge of the open grave with the satchel under his arm, and when he reached his position, he opened the satchel, extracted a sealed document, and addressed the assembled mourners of Briarwick with the measured formality of a man reading a royal proclamation at a market cross. He introduced himself. He named his firm. He stated that he had been retained by Edward, the late Earl of Ashvale, for the purpose of reading a sealed codicil at the burial, pursuant to the late Earl's specific instruction, before the assembled witnesses of the interment. The county of Wiltshire went very quiet. Fenn broke the seal. He read 2 short clauses about the management of the Ashvale estate timber and a provision for a retired gamekeeper named Harwick. Then he cleared his throat a second time, turned the page, and read the sentence that Edward had apparently written with full knowledge of this exact morning and the grey gown and the spitting at the lich gate. I, Edward Arthur Grenville, 9th Earl of Ashvale, do hereby confirm and affirm the legal and binding marriage solemnized on the 14th day of March, 1819, between myself and Eliza Margaret Wren of Shrewsbury, now Eliza Margaret Grenville, Countess of Ashvale, said marriage having been contracted in legal form before Mr. Aldous Fenn as witness, and recorded in the Register of St. Giles, Briarwick, and suppressed from public announcement at her ladyship's request for the period of my continuing health, the said suppression being, by the terms of this codicil, hereby lifted. Fenn folded the document precisely along its original crease. Eliza did not move. She was aware of the sound the crowd made, which was not a sound so much as a collective intake of air, the way a room full of candles gutters when a window opens. She was aware of Dorothea's fan, which had been moving at a measured 3 beats to the second since the service ended, going suddenly and completely still. She was aware of Cecily's expression shifting from modest sympathy into something she could not name, and did not try to. She was aware of James, standing at the head of the grave, whose face had not moved at all. His face had not moved, and he had not looked at her. She did not know what that cost him. She could not know. She filed it. If Eliza's story moves you in these early moments, stay with it. There is more to see. The title on a document changes nothing about a woman standing until the right person decides to act on it. The walk back to Ashvale Hall was 40 minutes by the front drive, and Eliza walked it without a carriage, because she had not arranged a carriage, because she had not known how long she intended to stay, and had not wished to give the household staff instructions that might require revision. The drive was bordered by lime trees that had gone bare in October and stood now in their winter nakedness against the gray sky, their branches precise and legible as handwriting. Dorothea's landau passed her at the first bend. The curtain did not move. She was shown to the same room she had occupied for 3 years, a large, handsome room on the east side of the house that caught the morning light and had a view of the walled garden. The housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Price, who had served the Ashvale household for 30 years, brought a tray without being asked and set it on the table beside the fire without looking at Eliza directly. The tray contained tea, bread, and a small dish of quince preserve. Eliza thanked her. Mrs. Price said very quietly, that she was glad the matter had been clarified, and left before Eliza could respond. The matter, as Mrs. Price named it, had clarified nothing and everything simultaneously. Eliza held the legal title of Countess of Ashvale. She had held it for 3 years. She had been spat at in the churchyard not 4 hours ago by a woman who would not, in the ordinary way of things, have dared such a gesture in the presence of a countess. The title was written on a document that Fenn had returned to his satchel. The social order of Wiltshire was watching to see whether anyone of consequence intended to enforce it. Dorothea had not spoken to her. James had not spoken to her. Eliza drank her tea. She had 3 days before Dorothea's household staff, who had been running Ashvale in the interim without anyone formally directing them otherwise, would require a decision about the Christmas accounts. She had already reviewed the estate ledgers because Edward had encouraged her to review them, and she had the habit of thoroughness, and she knew that the north pasture's drainage required attention, and that the kitchen garden's south wall had been repointed badly and would need doing properly in the spring. These were things she could address. They were, she found, easier to hold in her mind than the image of James standing at the head of the grave with his face arranged into nothing at all. The house settled around her in its winter quiet. She heard from the direction of the long gallery above a sound she had heard twice before in 3 years, a dry, intermittent thudding, rhythmless and miserable, that she had learned to identify as Thomas. Thomas was 9 years old, the son of James's first marriage, and he had lived at Ashvale since his mother's death 2 years prior, in the custody of the household staff because his father lived in London, and the arrangement was understood by everyone except Thomas to be temporary. He was a slight boy, with his father's gray eyes and his mother's particular silence, and he had developed, in the 2 years since his mother died, a habit of retreating to the long gallery and hurling a leather ball at the oak paneling until the sound either exhausted him or attracted Mrs. Price, whichever came first. Eliza set down her cup. She had not been asked to manage Thomas. She had not been given responsibility for him. And she had not taken it, because Edward had counseled patience in all things, and James's permission had not been sought, and she was not in the habit of acting without permission in domains that were not clearly hers. She had, however, learned the gallery's acoustics in 3 years, and she knew the difference between the ball hitting the paneling in its ordinary rhythm and the ball hitting it with the particular speed and desperation that meant something had gone wrong. She went upstairs. Thomas was standing at the far end of the gallery, at the corner where the light came from a north window, and the portraits of the previous 4 Earls of Ashvale looked down from their gilded frames with the polished confidence of men who had never been required to account for anything. He had thrown the ball at the paneling until a split had opened in the leather along one seam, and he was still throwing it, or trying to, because his hands were shaking badly enough that his aim had gone entirely, and he had struck one of the portrait frames, which now hung at a small angle that had the look of an accident waiting to be discovered. He did not hear Eliza come in. She moved quietly when she chose to, and she chose to now. And she sat down on the low chest that sat against the east wall, the one that held the estate maps, and she did not say anything. Thomas threw the ball again. It hit the wainscoting below the portraits this time. He retrieved it. After a minute, Eliza said, "The Earl in the 3rd portrait always makes me think of a man who has just discovered a beetle in his pudding." Thomas stopped. He looked at her. He had not spoken to her in the 3 days since his father's arrival, not because he disliked her, but because he had gone inside himself in the way children go inside themselves when the adults around them begin moving quickly and speaking in lowered voices. He looked at the portrait she had indicated. The 3rd Earl was a heavy-jowled man in an elaborate cravat, painted circa 1760, with an expression of sustained and personal affront. "He does look like that," Thomas said. He was apparently a decent man otherwise, Eliza said. Your great-great-uncle, I think. He was a particular friend to his tenants. He also apparently lost 200 pounds at cards on a single evening in Bath, which your great-grandfather never let him forget. Thomas looked at the portrait for another moment, his grip on the damaged ball loosening slightly. Did you know him? I knew your grandfather's account of him. Edward told me stories. The ball was lowered to Thomas's side. His hands had steadied. She noted, or were steadying. The shaking working its way out as his attention moved from whatever was inside his chest to the painted face on the wall. Are you really a countess? He asked. Your grandfather made it so, Eliza said. Whether anyone believes it is a separate matter. He considered this with the gravity of a 9-year-old who has spent 2 years in a household where adult conversations stop when he enters a room. Then he came and sat on the estate map chest beside her, not touching, but close, and they sat together looking at the 4 earls of Ashville until the light from the north window went from gray to pewter, and the house below them resumed its ordinary sounds. It was James who found them. He had come upstairs, she gathered, because Mrs. Price had mentioned Thomas's absence from the schoolroom, and because James was, whatever else he was, a man who looked for his son when his son was missing. He appeared in the doorway of the gallery with a candle he had picked up at the stair landing, and the light from the candle was small against the gallery's length and caught the angles of his face in a way that was neither flattering nor unflattering, but was entirely accurate. The face of a man who had organized himself around a decision he now found he could not sustain. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at Thomas first, the way a parent looks at a child he has been afraid for, a quick inventory of limbs and expression. Then he looked at Eliza. She met his eyes for 3 seconds, and then looked at the 3rd Earl of Ashvale's beetle-affront face, and she did not look back. James stood in the doorway for a moment that had no comfortable name. Then he said, Thomas. It is time for supper. Thomas slid off the chest. He looked at Eliza as he went, the kind of look that children direct at adults who have surprised them by being reliable. Then he crossed the gallery to his father, and James put a hand briefly on the back of the boy's head, a gesture so unguarded that Eliza felt she had witnessed something she had no right to see. She heard James's footstep on the gallery floor as he moved to follow Thomas toward the door, and then she heard it stop. She did not look up. Thank you, James said. She said nothing. He left. That evening, alone in the study that had been Edward's and was now technically hers, she let herself feel for precisely 10 minutes the full weight of a situation that had no clean resolution. She was legally the Countess of Ashvale. She had legal title to a house in which she had no ally except a 9-year-old boy and a housekeeper who addressed her quietly. James had inherited the earldom. Dorothea had organized the county's opinion of her with the efficiency of a general deploying infantry. In 3 days, she had been spat at, cut directly, assessed by a room full of mourners, announced in public as something she had been for 3 years, and thanked in the dark by a man whose face she was developing the unfortunate habit of thinking about in the pauses between everything else. 10 minutes. Then she lit the second candle on the desk and went back to the drainage accounts. In the West Wing, James sat at the desk he had used as a boy, the portrait of his late wife at his elbow, where it had been placed by the housemaid who arranged guest rooms by habit rather than by instruction. He did not look at the portrait. He had not looked at it in 2 years, which was also how long Thomas had been silent in galleries and stairwells and at mealtimes, and if James connected these facts with each other and with the quality of his own conduct during the months after his wife's death, he felt that connection as a weight at the base of his sternum rather than as a thought he could examine. There was a letter in his coat pocket. placed there by Fenn at the churchyard gate, the late Earl's hand on the outside fold, his name in his uncle's writing. He had not opened it. He would open it, he told himself. Later. There were 3 weeks between the funeral and the Pembridge Winter Assembly, and in those 3 weeks, Eliza did what she had always done at Ashvale, which was to manage the things that required managing and to avoid the rooms where she was not wanted. She met with the estate steward on Tuesdays. She reviewed the kitchen accounts. She supervised the repointing estimate for the south wall of the kitchen garden. She took tea with Mrs. Price on Thursdays and learned, through the comfortable oblique language of 30-year housekeepers, which members of the staff were loyal to Dorothea's version of events and which had made their own adjustments after the reading of the codicil. James remained. He had not returned to London. She did not know why he remained, and she did not ask. And he did not explain himself. And so they moved through the house in parallel, meeting at mealtimes and at the estate steward's Tuesday sessions, and in the corridor outside the library with the mutual care of 2 people navigating a narrow passage. He ate breakfast alone. She noted that he went to Thomas's rooms each evening before supper. She noted that Thomas had stopped throwing the ball at the gallery paneling, though she had seen him in the gallery twice more, standing in front of the portraits as though they were a puzzle he was working through. She had not gone up again. She had let it be what it was. She was in the walled garden one afternoon, assessing the south wall with the mason's preliminary note in her hand, when she heard Dorothea's carriage in the front drive. She heard it, and kept reading the mason's note. Because there was nothing in the mason's note that required less attention. And because moving quickly to meet Dorothea in the hall would have communicated an anxiety she did not feel, and would not perform. Dorothea found her in the garden 20 minutes later. She stood at the garden gate in her black mantle and her garnet brooch, with Cecily at her shoulder, and a composure so total it was its own kind of statement. She looked at the south wall and at the mason's note, and at Eliza's plain day dress with the expression of a woman who has decided that the present difficulty is temporary, and is generously choosing not to make a scene about it. "My dear Mrs. Wren," Dorothea said. "My lady," Eliza said, without adjusting the form of address. Dorothea registered this without displaying it. She was 61 years old, the widow of the late Baron Pembridge, and she had been managing the Ashvale household social calendar since James's first wife had become unable to manage it herself, and she carried that history as a settled credential. She said, in a voice as smooth as dressed stone, that she had come to discuss the arrangements for Christmas, and that she hoped they could agree on a sensible division of responsibilities, given the somewhat irregular nature of the present situation. Eliza said that the arrangements for Christmas were in hand, and that she was happy to share the details. Dorothea said that James had expressed no opinion on the matter. Eliza said that James was welcome to express one. They regarded each other for a moment across the flagged path, 2 women who understood each other precisely and had no interest in pretending otherwise. Then Dorothea looked at Cecily, and Cecily's expression was one of practiced serenity, and Dorothea said, in the same smooth voice, that she hoped Eliza understood the difficult position this situation placed James in, and that she was sure a sensible woman would appreciate the value of a tidy resolution. Eliza asked what resolution Dorothea had in mind. Dorothea said, "A quiet acknowledgement of the title's technicality and a mutually agreeable withdrawal would be the kindest thing for all parties, particularly for Thomas." She paused. Poor child. He attaches himself so readily to whoever is near. The words landed where Dorothea intended them to land. Eliza felt them. She kept her face level and thanked Dorothea for her concern and said she would think about what had been said. Dorothea left with Cecily at her heels, and Eliza stood at the south wall for a long time after the carriage noise faded from the drive, reading the same 3 lines of the Mason's note without absorbing any of them. 2 days later, the county received its invitations to the Pembridge Winter Assembly. The assembly was to be held at Dorothea's own house, Pembridge Hall, 3 miles from Ashvale, on the 20th of December. The invitations were printed on heavy creamstock with the Pembridge arms at the head. At the bottom of James's invitation, in Dorothea's hand, was a private note. Eliza did not see the note, because it was addressed to James, but she gathered its content the following morning when she came down to breakfast and found that the household, which had been quietly reorganizing itself around her title for 3 weeks, had shifted its axis again overnight. The footman who had been taking her instructions about the dining room fire had resumed addressing her as Mrs. Wren. Mrs. Price, whom she met on the back stairs, looked at her with an expression that was not unkind, but was very careful. The face of a woman managing knowledge she has been told to suppress. The estate steward arrived for the Tuesday meeting and said, before the accounts were opened, that he had received word from Lady Pembridge that the hall's steward would be liaising on the Christmas arrangements, and that he assumed this was consistent with Eliza's own wishes. She told him it was not. She reviewed the accounts. She gave her instructions. She went to find James. He was in the library. He stood at the window with his back to the door, looking at the lime trees on the drive, and he was holding an open letter in both hands, a letter she recognized by the paper's color and by the particular stillness with which he held it, the stillness of a man who has been reading the same page for a long time. She said his name. Just his name. He turned. His face, in the library's winter light, was not blank. It was the face of a man who has opened a letter he has been avoiding for 3 weeks, and found in it the account of his own absence, rendered in the words of someone who loved him, and was past anger about it. She could not read the letter from the doorway. She did not need to. "I owe you an apology," he said. She said, "There is time for that. Dorothea has told your steward that she is managing Christmas." Something shifted in the line of his jaw. "I did not authorize that." "She appears to have taken your silence as authorization." He looked at the letter once more. She watched him fold it along its crease and place it in his coat pocket with a care that was not habitual, but decided. He looked at her across the length of the library, and she held her ground and did not look away first, because there had been a particular quality in his voice on the word apology that she was trying to understand and could not understand if she turned from it. He said, "Come to the assembly." She said, "What are you proposing?" "Nothing yet." His voice was level, and under the level surface of it there was something she had no period-appropriate name for, a quality of attention that was not comfort and not sympathy, but was, she thought, recognition. "But I am asking you to come." She thought of Thomas in the gallery with the damaged ball. She thought of Dorothea's particular emphasis on the word tidy. She said, "I will come." She should not have gone. This is the thing she knew by the time the Pembridge Winter Assembly reached its 7th dance, and Dorothea moved through the room with Cecily on her arm, and the expression of a woman managing a very smooth piece of business. Eliza stood at the edge of the assembly room in a gown of dark blue wool that was the best she had, which was nevertheless not the best in the room by a margin of several £100 and several inches of Brussels lace. She knew 4 people. She had been addressed twice as Mrs. Wren, and once as, she thought she heard correctly, the widow person. Dorothea had welcomed her at the door with a warmth so perfectly gauged as to communicate, to every observer, that the welcome was a generous condescension and not a recognition. The county watched. The county always watched. She held her glass of lemon water, and she kept her shoulders back, and she watched the room in return. It was at the 8th dance that Dorothea called for attention. She stood at the center of the assembly room, and she called for the music to pause, and she announced, in her smooth and carrying voice, that she had a small piece of news that she was certain would please everyone gathered, that James, the Earl of Ashvale, had expressed his intention to pursue a formal understanding with Miss Cecily Hargrove, and that they were delighted to share this among friends before the new year. The room received this with the warm murmur that rooms give to announcements that confirm what they have already decided to believe. Cecily looked at the floor with the correct expression of pleased modesty. Eliza looked at James. He was standing at the far side of the room, near the window that looked out on Pembridge Hall's formal garden, and his face was doing the thing it did when he was deciding what he thought. The careful blankness she had catalogued at a distance for 3 years, and at close range for 3 weeks. He was looking at Dorothea. See, he had not known this was coming. She was certain of that. She was certain of it the way she was certain of the South Wall's drainage problem and the 4th Earl's card debts, through accumulated particular evidence and a mind that did not permit itself the luxury of wishful interpretation. She set down her glass. She walked to the room's side door, the one that gave onto the corridor, and from there to the entrance hall, and from there to the front drive. And she was not running, but she was moving with the purpose of a woman who has made a decision and intends to act on it before she can unmake it. The decision was this: she would return to Ashvale, she would collect what was hers, and she would go to her cousin in Bath, and she would write to Fenn in the morning, and she would manage the legal situation from Bath, where it could not cost James the engagement he deserved, or Thomas the steady household he needed, and where no one would spit at her in a churchyard because no one in Bath knew her name. The drive was long and dark, and the cold was the particular cold of a Wiltshire December that smells of frozen mud and bare hedgerow, and by the time she had walked the first 100 yards from Pembridge Hall's front steps, she was breathing in the short, controlled way she breathed when she was managing something large in a small container. She heard feet on the gravel behind her. She did not stop, because stopping would have made conversation necessary. And she was not ready for conversation. She was not ready for whatever James's face would do in the dark, when there were no social witnesses to make his expression a considered performance. Eliza, not Mrs. Wren. Her name, just her name, said the way a man says a word he has been holding in his mouth for longer than was comfortable. She stopped. He came level with her. She could see his breath in the cold air, which meant he had come without his coat, which meant he had left the assembly room the moment she had left it, which was a piece of information she was trying very hard not to give its proper weight. "I did not authorize what Dorothea announced tonight," he said. "I know," she said. "It does not matter." "It matters," he said, and his voice had lost its level surface entirely, which was not something she had heard before, not in 3 weeks, and not in the 3 years of his occasional visits to Ashvale. And she turned to look at him, and his face in the dark was not the face of a man deciding what he thought. It was the face of a man who had decided and was finding the edges of the decision very sharp. "My uncle wrote to me," he said, in the letter. "About Thomas," she said. "About you. About Thomas." He put his hand to the pocket where the letter lived, and then brought it back without taking the letter out, as though the action was instinct rather than intention. "He wrote that you sat with Thomas when no one else came, that you did not perform it, and did not report it, and did not ask anything in return. He wrote that he had been ashamed of how little he understood you when you arrived, and how much he understood you at the end. The lime trees stood black against the sky. The cold pressed at the edges of her jaw. He also wrote, James said, that I was the man most likely to make the same mistake he had made, and that he was asking me, from wherever letters go after a person is gone, not to do it. She looked at him for a long time. She thought of the gallery and the damaged ball and the 4 earls in their gilded frames. She thought of 3 years of quarterly visits and hallway distances, and meals taken separately, and a face kept deliberately unreadable in a churchyard, while a solicitor named her a countess in front of the spitting woman and the garnet brooch. You have a son who needs consistency, she said, and Dorothea will not stop. I know what I have, he said. I am asking whether you are still willing to stay inside it. She breathed out. The breath was visible in the cold air for a moment, a small white cloud that dissolved at once. I have been inside it for 3 years, she said. He offered her his arm. She took it, and they stood in the dark at the edge of the Pembridge Drive for a moment, before turning back toward the lights of the assembly room. And she felt the particular solidity of his arm through the wool of her sleeve. And she did not remark on it. And he did not remark on it. And the cold continued to press at her jaw, and the lime trees continued to be black against the sky, and she thought, this is the actual thing. The thing after the document, and the churchyard, and the 3 years of quiet management, and she let herself feel it without putting it in a smaller container. They went back inside. Dorothea saw them come through the door together. Dorothea's fan had been moving at its measured 3 beats to the second, and at the sight of James's hand covering Eliza's on his arm, it stilled, as it had stilled at the graveside, and for the first time in 40 years of managing rooms like this one, Lady Dorothea Pembridge did not know what she intended to do next. James walked Eliza into the center of the assembly room, and he walked there deliberately, not along the edge but through the middle, where the light was brightest, and the county's attention was unavoidable. And the room shifted its weight the way rooms shift when the highest-ranking person in them has just performed an act the hierarchy was not expecting. He stopped. He waited until the conversations around them had faltered and the musicians had let their instruments go quiet, and then he said, in the carrying voice of a man accustomed to being heard without raising his volume, I should like to correct a misapprehension that has been allowed to stand too long. The room was still. This is Eliza, Countess of Ashvale, he said. She has been so for 3 years. She will be so as long as Ashvale stands. I recommend she be addressed accordingly. Not a speech. A sentence, or close enough. The room received it in a held, collective silence of about 10 seconds, which is a very long time in a county assembly room, and then it began, carefully, to rearrange itself. Cecily looked at the floor. Her expression, for the single private moment before she composed it, was that of a person who has been playing a very good hand and has just understood that the cards were counted before she sat down. Dorothea said, James. Just his name, the way she had been saying it for 30 years. With the authority of a woman who had organized the world around a particular understanding and was finding the understanding revised in a public room. She said it once, and he looked at her with the patient, level regard of a man who has decided, and she did not say it again. She sat down. She folded her hands in her lap. Her face, to its credit, did not collapse. It performed a controlled and dignified adjustment, which was, Eliza thought, the best that could be asked of a woman whose identity was organized around a position she had just been asked to vacate. Mrs. Price had told her, on a Thursday over tea, that Dorothea had been kind to Thomas in her way, that she had sent him books and had arranged his schoolroom schedule, and had genuinely believed she was managing his welfare. Eliza held this now. She held it as evidence of the difference between organizing a person's world and seeing them inside it. The music resumed. The county, which is always ultimately a practical organism, began to behave itself. James said very quietly, for her alone, "I am sorry it was not sooner." She said, "You are here now." He was. That was the actual material fact of the situation, and she had been dealing in material facts for 3 years, and she trusted them more than she trusted the kind of hope that anticipated facts rather than observed them. He was here. She was here. The musicians were playing a country dance she had last danced at a Shrewsbury assembly 7 years ago, when she had been 21 and had not yet learned to look away first. And she did not look away now. They danced. It was not the bold choice of a man performing his feelings for an audience. It was the quiet, decided act of a man and a woman who had been moving in parallel through a large house for 3 weeks and had finally admitted they were heading in the same direction. By the time December had finished its work and the Ashvale Drive was frozen at the edges, and the lime trees held their bare arms against a sky that had been threatening snow since the 20th, the household had settled around a new center of gravity, with the practicality of households that have been well managed for 30 years, and know the difference between a change that requires adjustment and a change that rights a long-standing error. The kitchen accounts were in order. The south wall's repointing estimate had been approved. The north pasture's drainage was surveyed and a contractor engaged for the spring. These were not romantic facts, but they were Eliza's facts, the facts she had lived inside for 3 years while the hierarchy arranged its opinions around her silence, and they felt, to her, like home in a way that the home itself had only lately begun to feel. Thomas had stopped going to the gallery to throw the ball. He had begun, instead, appearing in the doorway of whatever room Eliza was working in, not asking for anything, simply sitting in the chair nearest the fire with one of the estate maps on his knee, identifying the drainage problem in the north pasture, naming the fields, tracing the water table's path to the river with a finger that had his father's precision and something of his grandfather's particularity about facts. He was sitting in that chair on the evening it finally snowed. The fire in the study's hearth was the warm, settled kind of fire that a house achieves when it has been consistently tended, and the snow at the window was the slow, soft snow that descends in vertical lines when the air is perfectly still, and Thomas had fallen asleep with the estate map sliding gently from his knee to the hearthrug. James reached across and lifted the map from the floor, setting it on the table without disturbing the boy. And he stayed bent for a moment, looking at his son's face in the firelight, with the expression of a man who has put down something he carried for a long time and has not yet learned the sensation of his own hands without it. Eliza watched him straighten. She watched him look at Thomas and then at the window, and then at her. She had, on a shelf above the study's west window, a small watercolor miniature that Edward had pressed into her hand in the 2nd year of their marriage. A quick, informal study of the Ashvale East Garden at midsummer, done by some forgotten amateur hand, and framed in a cheap gilt that had gone dull with time. He had given it to her because she had admired the light in it, the particular way the artist had caught the lime trees in full leaf with the morning coming through them, and she had kept it on the shelf because the light in it was accurate to this specific house and this specific garden, and she had wanted, in the 3 years of her quiet management of a life she was not permitted to publicly own, a single material object that confirmed she was exactly where she believed herself to be. James followed her gaze to the miniature. He said, "He gave you that on the 3rd Christmas. I recognize the frame. I thought he'd sold it." "He gave it away," she said. "He was particular about who received what he valued." James looked at the small painting for a long moment. Outside, the snow continued its vertical descent against the dark, and Thomas breathed in his sleep, and the fire settled into its own weight with the click of cooling wood. He was particular, James said, and he was not wrong. Outside, the world was becoming white. If you have stayed with Eliza through all of it, leave a word in the comments for the moment that settled into you. Every story in this collection is built the same way, from one woman standing still in a world moving against her, and from the particular quality of attention that changes everything. There are more to come.